Good morning, everyone, and thanks very much for joining us today on this beautiful sunshiny day. I know how hard it must be if you're staring out a window right now. I'd like to thank you for joining us for this fifth in webinar series by the South Coast Conservation Program on species at risk conservation. And a special thanks to our sponsors, the Canadian Society of Environmental Biologists, for hosting us through their webinar platform. I'd also like to thank Environment and Climate Change Canada. I can never get over that new acronym. Environment and Climate Change Canada through their funding through the Habitat Stewardship Program for species at risk. I also want to just talk a little bit about the South Coast Conservation Program because I can't get through a webinar without actually doing a little bit of a plug for ourselves. And it's been a very diverse number of years that we've been working. As I said, this is the fifth in a series of webinars. We'll have another couple of webinars for the rest of 2018, 2019, and hopefully we'll continue this series on in perpetuity as long as we can. And just to let you know a little bit about ourselves, we are a fairly broad-based organization. Our focus is on species and ecosystems at risk, but we work with a number of different audiences, including private landowners, developers, local governments, as well as other stewardship groups and academia, again, focused on that species and ecosystems at risk conversation. Our first presenter today is Laura Kehoe. She's with the Baum Lab at the University of Victoria and the Martin Conservation Decisions Lab at the University of British Columbia. She's going to be focusing her presentation this morning on prioritizing threat management strategies to ensure long-term resilience of the Fraser River Estuary. And this is a particular project that the South Coast Conservation Program has had the privilege of being part of in regards to the decision support work that Laura is working on. Okay, Laura, I am going to hand it over to you. And just remember to unmute your microphone as well.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for the introduction and for inviting me to speak in this webinar. So the work that I'm doing is essentially figuring out the best ways to prioritize management actions when data might be scarce and systems are complex. And this is a postdoc with, as you mentioned, Julia Baum and Tara Martin. And so our study area is the Fraser River Estuary, as you can see here from the satellite imagery. And so what I'm going to do is I'll just present a little bit on the Fraser and the data that we have so far for the Fraser, and then I'll talk a little bit about our approach and why it can be useful, and then talk a little bit about a project that we ran this approach with already, so that I can share some results so that you can see sort of what results will look like and get a better understanding of our approach. And then I'll give you a quick timeline of when we'll be able to share results, hopefully, on the Fraser. And so, hold on a second. There we go. So the Fraser, as most of you probably know, it's one of the world's greatest rivers and greatest estuaries. And historically, it produced more salmon than any other place in North America. It's the rearing and feeding grounds of over 50 species of fish, 14 of which are of conservation concern, and many of which play a crucial role in a food web that really links fish, birds, and marine mammals across thousands of kilometers, spanning across the Pacific Ocean. So this estuary also forms one of the richest and most important ecosystems for migrant and wintering waterbirds in Canada, and I'm sure James will speak a little bit to that. It's an area of international importance, and for that reason it's an IBA, and it supports nationally significant numbers of such species such as barn owls and peregrine falcons. And in total, 50 species of shorebirds, according to my sources, have been recorded in the area. And in total, there's around 106 birds of conservation concern, depending on which criteria you're using. So alongside that, the Fraser is also of huge economic importance. So it's the home of prime real estate and very high industrial importance also. So just to give you a few examples that impressed me. So soil in the Fraser Valley, for example, supports some of the most fertile agricultural land in Canada. And annually, this generates more than 62% of the province's gross farm receipts. And that equates to $1.6 billion. The lower mainland has over 50% of BC's population and over $50 billion worth of development in the floodplain. The port function is also very impressive. It rivals that of Canadian traffic on the St. Lawrence Seaway, and that's both in terms of tonnage and jobs. And on top of that, Port Metro Vancouver is the largest port in Canada in terms of export tonnage. In terms of export tonnage, actually, it's the largest in North America. So obviously, it's of huge importance to many different people and to many different species in different ways. And that means that we have this confluence of threats. And so the estuary, in my mind, is on the brink. And so 80% of wetlands, sometimes up to 90% of wetlands, depending on the source, have been altered or destroyed in this region. And according to Ducks Unlimited, at current rates of loss, waterfowl will find no usable agricultural land in the Fraser River Delta in 25 years. According to other reports, there are also up to 11 ecosystems at risk in and around the Fraser River estuary. And so this is a map of our study area, and you can see in blue, this is the aquatic study area, and then we have a wide line drawn around those blue areas where we're including all of the species of concern and the threats. And so just to give you a kind of a bit of a nightmare slide, these are some of the threats. So we have a lot of different major developments that are proposed. And on top of that, we also have ongoing agricultural intensification. We have ongoing fishing pressure, urban and commercial development. So really there's a lot to take in here. So many new developments are planned. And there's, on top of that, aggressive invasive species. So for example, Spartina is replacing mudflats with monoculture, and that can reduce fish and waterfowl habitat. And then, of course, a threat that I haven't mentioned yet, but that you often hear about is climate change. That's particularly severe in the Salish Sea, and it's predicted that it will result in sea level rise of up to 1 meter by the end of the century. And it's not just sea level rise, it's also that the water temperature will increase, which can affect many different species that spawn and rear in the estuary. So I apologize to be so depressing on a sunny day, but hopefully, as you will see, we're developing an approach that will be able to quantify how to abate these threats in the most cost-effective way. So first of all, we compiled a list of all species of conservation concern, and we defined that by 3 main criteria, and that was whether they are BC list status of red or blue, or whether they hold a COSWIC or SARA status that shows that they are threatened. Also, if they're within the conservation framework priority from 1 to 3, they were included, or if they were priority species in the BCR5 reports. We also included species that are of high cultural and/or economic importance. And so our final list is summarized in this graph, and right now we have 158 species included, and you just get an idea here of the BC list status of the main kind of species groups that we've involved here. So land birds are the most numerous species with over 40 species, and so on. So following that, we trawled through all of the reports on all of our species at risk, and we looked at common threats. And so this is the percentage of species that are threatened by the top, I think this is the top 10 threats. And so habitat loss, not surprising, is the #1 threat, affecting over 40% of species. And then on from there, we have natural systems modification, we have agriculture, aquatic resources, we have pollution, residential commercial developments, and so on. So this just gives you a kind of an overview of how exactly our species that we've identified, how they are threatened. So in conservation in general, we have a significant investment in understanding threats. So the published research and a lot of projects coming up, they focus on threats. And that makes sense because we need to know what the threats are in order to actually develop management actions. But the problem is that less work then focuses on developing those management actions to abate these threats, especially with regard to which actions are most effective, which ones really work. And so the priority threat management framework can fill the gap of which actions should we take in this study region that would allow us to conserve the most species. It's a participatory approach that uses expert knowledge. So we hunt down all of the most knowledgeable experts working in the region, and we work with them to figure out what are the best management actions for this area. Sorry. And so in this approach, we can answer these kinds of questions. So for example, the number one question is often which actions are the most cost effective? In other words, which actions will save the most species per dollar spent? Importantly, we can also answer questions like how many species can be conserved for a given budget. So if we have 10 million a year versus 2 million a year, what actions are the best to take and how many species can be conserved under those actions? It's also important in that it can allow us to know what species and/or ecosystems could be lost without any management. And so at the end, we'll have a table that will show that some species will be very unlikely to persist in the estuary unless we act. It will also tell us which species are unable to be saved irrespective of management. So there are some species that we simply don't have a management action that will bring their probability of persistence above a certain threshold. And I'll explain those terms in a couple of slides. But those two aspects are quite important to know, and they help to divert funds in the most cost-effective way. Okay, so you're probably wondering, how do we actually do it? So there's a couple of main steps that we take. The first is that we define our objectives. And so an objective can be something like conserving the most species in terms of their persistence in the area, or if we only have a few species, we can look at specific recovery objectives on a species by species basis. We can also look at ecosystem objectives rather than working on a species level. After that, we state any constraints that we have. So that could be monetary constraints, it could be time constraints, it could be the availability of experts and their constraints. Then we list our biodiversity assets. So if our objective is to conserve the most species over a 20-year time frame, then what we need to know is, well, how many species are there? So we trawl through the literature and we work with experts to figure out the biodiversity assets, whether that be species or ecosystems. We can then weight these. So we can say, well, we think that species of cultural importance should be weighted more heavily than others, or potentially we think that species of phylogenetic uniqueness could be weighted more heavily. So we can weight the species however way we like, and that can be done after the main analysis. And that can be done to test whether or not our answers remain the same, even if we weight species in different ways. For our project on the Fraser right now, we're weighting all species equally, but we can play around with that to see if our answers change. Then we list the management actions that could abate the threats facing our biodiversity assets. And so that normally starts out by reading a lot of different reports, especially if there are actions already developed for the estuary or for the region of concern, and compiling all of that into one document and then presenting that to an expert panel. And with those experts, we work to improve those actions to make sure that they will be hopefully close to the optimal actions to take in an area, while still being realistic. So not, not a complete dream, something that's still a feasible option. From these, then, we calculate for each management action the costs over our time period. So for the Fraser, we chose a 25-year time period. The benefits of taking each action on our species of concern, and I'll talk more about that in a second, and the feasibility of each action. And the feasibility is a measure of whether or not it's a realistic action. So that's a combination of the uptake, so what's the probability that people will actually do it, whether that be if we're working with farmers for beneficial farmland management practices, or if it's governmental policy that we want taken up, or if it's just a public outreach campaign. And then the other part of feasibility is the success. So how likely is that action to really be effective? Is it well tested? Are we sure that it will work well? Or is it kind of dependent on factors that are hard to predict? So one good example of feasibility that Tara Martin has from her work in Australia is keeping cats indoors. It would be a very cost-effective action, because then obviously a lot of bird species would do a little bit better. But it isn't feasible because there isn't the public support for keeping cats indoors and spaying the cats that are hard to catch. So the problem there is that it was downranked by feasibility, and therefore it wasn't the most cost-effective action. So it's an important aspect to keep in mind when thinking about implementing these actions. So following that, we employ a cost-effectiveness analysis, and that allows us to rank our actions in terms of which are the most cost-effective to take in the region. And so we get, fairly simply, you know, number one best action, number two, number three. We also, so this is, I'll get back to, sorry. So this is the formula for the cost effectiveness analysis. And it's essentially the benefits that I mentioned. And that's in terms of the probability of the species persisting compared to a baseline of no action occurring. And then we have the feasibility that I just mentioned. So those two are multiplied, and then that's all divided by the costs. So penalized by very expensive actions will be ranked lower. And so I'll give you an example to make this a little bit clearer. So this is the south of the divide. It's an area in Saskatchewan, and it's 1.4 million hectares, and it supports 15 species of conservation concern. And so the objective here was to conserve the greatest number of species over a period of 20 years. And so what we did was, I'm just going to show you an example of some of the actions that we listed out. So we have regulation and policy, and within that we have a number of sub-actions that we can carry out. We have artificial nesting, pest control, infrastructure management, and fire management. And so I'll show you some preliminary results. So for this, for example, the benefits are that regulation and policy is number one, and then we follow down to number 5, fire management. So this is the sum of the improved persistence probability of our 15 species. We then multiply that by feasibility, and you can see that it's working out well so far in that the first two actions are also the most feasible. When we divide by cost, you can see that there's larger differences between these actions in terms of their total cost. And so when we finally get our cost effectiveness metric, if you look on the left-hand side here, you'll see that we go from them being ranked in order to all of a sudden infrastructure management becoming the most cost effective. And that's because it is by far and away the most affordable action in this list. Now, this is just an example. This isn't the final result from south of the divide, but it gives you an idea of how this can play out in guiding your decision making. It also, we can also look at complementary sets of strategies, and this is a crucial step in this analysis. So we don't want to just know what's the most cost-effective thing to do. We also want to know, if we have a budget of $4 million, what are the best combinations of actions that we can take? And so, for example, and this is, I should warn you, this is really not the true answer because we're still developing these results. This is just a mock-up for the sake of explanation. And so you can see here on the y-axis, we have the number of species conserved. And so right away, you can see that 10 out of 15 species will be lost without any action. So for $0 here, we have 5 species conserved. You can see that 8 species can be saved with action up here. And then going along this graph, you can see that infrastructure management will give 2 species for 0.5 million. And then you can see going up, different actions combined with previous actions can conserve more and more species, to the point where this final action combined with the rest can conserve 8 species. You can also see that 2 species are lost regardless of action. And that can be for many reasons. That can be because they're migratory, and so actually the threats outside of the study area are larger than the threats inside the study area. Or that can be because we haven't found the right actions that are likely to conserve that species. Or it can simply be because the population is now so low, it's just unlikely that at this point those species can be conserved. But again, this is just a mock-up for the sake of explaining this to you. One thing to keep in mind when looking at the complementary figure is that because it's trying to capture the combinations of strategies which benefit as many species as possible for per dollar invested, it doesn't necessarily recommend investment in the top most cost-effective strategies individually. And that's particularly so if those top strategies all benefit the same species. So it will select strategies according to whether or not they're hitting on new species that we can include that can be conserved. And so the application so far to the Fraser River Estuary, we're at the point now where there's no current management plan in the Fraser, but so far we have brought together over 30 collaborators, and we have compiled a species of conservation concern list with 158 species so far. We have 10 major management actions with a lot of sub-actions listed, and we have an expert contact database of over 25 experts that we're working with. And so we've held a number of meetings since last year, and right now we're at the point where we have our data in terms of the benefits, the costs and the feasibility of actions. We're still waiting on a couple of people to get their final estimates in, and after that we'll be able to analyze the results, and we should have first results this spring, and hopefully we'll be submitting our paper with those full results along with a kind of a glossy prospectus for policymakers in summer, autumn time. And so that's basically it in a nutshell. I hope I didn't go too fast and it was clear enough. I want to thank my supervisors, Tara Martin. She's the one that's really pioneered this approach in Australia and New Zealand. So it's been applied to over a quarter of Australia and all of New Zealand. And what they found is that you can actually double the cost effectiveness by using this complementary approach where you use different sets of strategies to cover the most species. And so she's now working she's just got a professorship starting soon in Canada. And so she's coming back to where she's originally from, and she's bringing this approach with her. And Julia Baum, thanks also to her. So I'm based out at UBIC in Julia's lab. And Jessie Lund, who's our fantastic research assistant, who did a lot of the hard work trawling through all of those reports to get our large database together. And of course, I want to thank Meopar, who have funded this project and who have been fantastic in providing training and grants. And of course, we couldn't do this project because it's a participatory approach without the many, many ecological experts and collaborators that have been involved. So I want to very, very genuinely and deeply thank them for all of the time that they've put towards this. If you do want more information, there's 2 key references here. One is by Carwardine, and it's Prioritizing Threat Management for Biodiversity Conservation, and that gives you an overview of the approach. And the other is by Tara Martin, and that's eliciting expert knowledge in conservation science, which gives you more of the sort of overview of how to do this work with experts. And so thank you very much. That's it for me for now, but I'd be happy to take questions whenever the question time starts. Cheers.
Great, thanks very much, Laura. And I got my feasibility responses back on time, although Laura did have to prod me a few times to get them. But from the South Coast Conservation Program's perspective, these types of analyses or methods of doing cost-benefit analysis for conservation are very relevant because many of the audiences that we deal with, especially I would say local government decision makers, although certainly at higher levels of government, the questions get asked quite a bit, are around the issues of cost. When it comes to conservation, especially for rare and vulnerable species or species that are declining, a lot of times they don't necessarily have the perception of value across a general audience or in decision makers' minds. So we always have to think about the feasibility aspects of the work that we're doing.
Absolutely.
If anybody who's attending has any questions, there is a question tab that should be on your little menu platform for GoTo. And if you can type in your questions there, and then if you just want to send them to me, I can read them out. If you want to send them to all, I'll still read them out for Laura and James when that time comes. Or you can use your chat box. So I'll give you a minute to, if you've got any questions, to formulate those. And I do have a question for you, and I'm going to ask James this question at the end of his presentation as well. What are your perspectives in regards to the recent view by the federal government about the impacts to biofilm and spotted sandpipers for the Terminal 2 project, that the costs to the environment sort of outweigh the project itself? So I mean, there's a lot of, I guess, sudden response that, oh, does this mean that the project's going to be rejected or not?
I find it very difficult to predict whether or not it would be rejected on the basis of that. I think that it was a strong position that they took, and I would agree with it from what I know about the importance of biofilm, and what I suspect the impact on biofilm would be. I think that the media somehow over-exaggerated a little bit. I think one of the media headlines was "last nail in the coffin" or something for T2 expansion. I don't think it's the last nail in any coffin. I'd be curious to know whether or not, if it isn't allowed to go ahead there, would it go ahead somewhere else, like somewhere further in stream of the estuary? But I'm not. That's all I really know enough to talk about. I think James could probably give a more eloquent response on it. But,
Thanks. So I appreciate that. Yeah, no, and I didn't want to put you on the spot either, because that we have a number of contentious projects on the South Coast right now, sort of sitting in our backyard, and it'd be very interesting to see how these things play out in regards to the work that many of us do. Okay, I'm not seeing any pithy questions coming through, either through the questions or through the chat box. If you have any questions for Laura, just want to remind you that this webinar will be broadcast on the SCCP's YouTube channel. It usually takes about a week or two to get the video processed, and then I will post it up for the SCCP. And I'll make sure, if you like us on Facebook, you'll get a notification that the webinar is ready to be viewed. If you want to watch specific information again, you're always welcome to contact Laura or James to follow up with them further about the work that they're doing. And I'll have information for contacting the SCCP and the URL for our YouTube channel, etc., on the back end of this presentation. All right, so without further ado, I would like to turn it over to James. James Casey is the manager Fraser programs for Bird Studies Canada. He's going to be focusing on the potential solutions to address the impacts of recreational disturbance to coastal birds. Aside from the fact that many of these species are of conservation concern or listed species at risk, the habitats that this project includes coastal sand ecosystems, as an example, are very important to the work that the South Coast Conservation Program does. So again, we've been privileged to be part of this project in regards to providing feedback and being involved in updates on it. So James, you can unmute yourself, and I am going to send you the presenter request. Perfect. Thank you. Go ahead. Oh, I think you have to unmute yourself, James. All right, just 1 minute. I'll see if we can fix that.
Hey,
All right, go ahead. There we go.
Excellent. Hi, everyone. Thanks, Pamela, for the introduction. For those that don't know me, I joined Bird Studies Canada here in June of last year to focus on the Fraser. So just starting to work on this project, I guess, and still developing an understanding of the various complex issues that Laura has highlighted. So thank you to Pamela for inviting us to present. Hopefully everyone finds this informative. Oh, why is it not going to the next slide? Oh, down here. Not everyone is familiar with Bird Studies Canada, since we do tend to be fairly focused on birds and monitoring. So Bird Studies Canada is a national organization with 3 staff here in BC, focused on conservation monitoring, partnerships, and looking for solutions to maintain bird habitats across the country, birds and bird habitat across the country. To the left there, you see holding a long-billed curlew, David Bradley, who is the BC program manager. And then there is also a lady named Karen Devitt who works in BC that does a lot of the citizen science engagement monitoring activities. BSC has been fairly active actually in BC for a number of years now, actually participating under a different organization way back in the 50s through the Christmas bird count, which is quite familiar with folks. But we also run a number of other programs, some which may not be nearly as familiar with such things as the nocturnal owl surveys. All of these programs are delivered in partnerships with local conservation groups and volunteers. And I've highlighted in red there the Coastal Waterbird Survey. So that's been running since 1999 and is a very useful source of data for 18 years worth of data on coastal waterbirds in the region. And I've used it a lot since joining BSC and encourage others to track that down that are operating in the estuary. As mentioned by Pamela, the Fraser Estuary, and by Laura, I guess, the Fraser Estuary is a major piece of bird habitat and has been designated as an important bird and biodiversity area by BirdLife International. It's Nature Canada and BSC partner in delivering work in the IBAs across Canada, and BC Nature manages a caretaker network for IBAs across the country. So, across BC. So a lot of this work isn't possible without some of those other partners. In all, 15 bird species trigger the IBA designation for the Fraser. The list is on the side there. And it's important to highlight that unlike the Species at Risk program, the IBA designation is triggered for areas that have greater than 1% of the global population located or using this area on a regular basis. So really it's not just a rarity thing, but can also be a measure of abundance. So this picture here is of one of those species that actually uses about 95% of its population uses the Fraser on a regular basis, the Western Sandpiper. And as Pamela alluded to, the Western Sandpiper uses the biofilm mudflat complex off of in the intertidal areas to feed. It's actually a picture of 15,000 Western Sandpipers or thereabouts and one Dunlin. So if you want to try and find the Dunlin, it's in there. One of the reasons this region is so important for birds, one of probably two, I guess, is that the diversity of habitats that exist on the Fraser provides a range of habitat types for different species. And I think this image is from the South Coast Conservation Program website, and it's for me, a really powerful one. One of my favorite sites when I'm out hiking is to look down into valleys and see the massive wetland complex that lies below. I can just imagine being up on Seymour or Grouse or something and looking down on historic Fraser Delta, and you have this huge wetland. Unfortunately, we've lost, as Laura highlighted, more than 75% of that wetland, but pre-contact, the estuary supported billions of birds. It still supports roughly 1 million or slightly over 1 million in a given year, but you can see that prior to loss, it was a very productive and important area. The other piece of this puzzle is that the estuary is located along the migratory flyway for birds traveling along the Pacific coast. So from down in South America, Panama, Peru, up through into California, Alaska, and even over into Russia, birds traveling that flyway will be stopping into the Fraser Estuary on long-term migrations. And then there's also more localized east-west migrations where birds using the Rockies or just over the Rockies will come into the estuary as well. And lastly, we'll get coastal migrations where we have birds overwintering in the region from elsewhere in BC. And it's one of the reasons that the estuary is Canada's largest aggregation of overwintering raptors. And so while that historic context is still relevant, as illustrated in this particular image, the complexity is still there. You still see this diversity of habitat in terms of the offshore, where you get your seabirds, the intertidal, where you get your foragers like the sandpipers and the Dunlin, up into the agricultural lands, which are replaced what used to be wetland, and you have species like your Dunlin and your waterfowl, into the more terrestrial or even urban environments where you have your songbirds, and your passerines and that kind of thing. And this is to reiterate that fact that it takes that full diversity of habitat to maintain these birds. And this is a flock of Dunlin that are documented to use both the ocean side of the dike, so the intertidal habitats, and then migrate into the farmers' fields and use the farm field just on the other side of the dike. And so you'll see this behavior in a large number of species. The other day I was out and it was the popular snow geese that were using both sides of the dike as habitats. And of course, barn owls, short-eared owls, peregrine falcons, harrier, and the iconic bald eagle are all using these various habitats as hunting grounds. And along the edges or in the trees, you're going to find your much smaller songbirds, finches, warblers, that kind of thing, including one of our listed species, the barn swallow there. So basically, I'm hoping to establish here that the Fraser is a critical piece of bird habitat, and really it enriches our lives in terms of our opportunities to go out and witness this richness, this diversity and abundance that the functioning ecosystem provides. And we do this in a number of ways. We go out bird watching for some of us just have backyard bird feeders, or some of us have the luxuries of going out and kayaking or walking on the beach. And these are all very enjoyable activities that are enriched by the diversity of life that we see out there. Unfortunately, these activities can also have negative consequences, which we're going to touch on a bit. But as Laura has highlighted, there are a number of activities that are threatening the continued health and function of this estuary. And so in 2016, BirdLife International designated the Fraser as an IBA in danger, and Nature Canada and Bird Studies Canada partnered to hire me to work on trying to develop conservation solutions. A range of threats, probably the top four here are transportation infrastructure, agricultural land conversions, climate adaptation and diking, and then urban development. I've also added in here a photo of an eagle. It's become a major complicating issue, or something to consider as we develop our conservation strategies, especially for birds, because it is a predator that is recovering in the region since the protection of this species and others through the banning of DDTs and protection of their nest habitats, or improved effort to protect their nesting habitats, which is great to see, but it's having knock-on consequences for all of our other, or a range of our other bird species. And there was a paper that just came out this month touching on those consequences that I would recommend looking up. I can provide to those that want it later. But it adds a factor of complexity when we think about conservation in this region. So as I mentioned, I was brought on in June to start developing conservation solutions, and I use a slightly different tool than Laura, though complementary, I think, something called the Open Standards for the Practice of Conservation. And it's really a two-step tool to help us understand both what's driving the impacts that we are seeing, and then developing some strategies that we can apply to address those impacts. And based on our initial year of learning, or just about year of learning, some of the main threats I highlighted already are transportation infrastructure, agricultural land conversions, so from potatoes and corn and peas and that sort of thing, over to berries and greenhouses and those types of activities, which don't support nearly the same level of biodiversity. Urban development and expansion, we all know that we're seeing increases of populations outside of the greater, or outside of the core Vancouver area, into the communities like Surrey and Richmond and Delta, which were historically agricultural lands. So those are putting far more pressure on the landscape. And we're going to dig into that particular one in a minute in a bit more detail. And then also, of course, climate-driven sea level rise and our response to that in terms of how do we manage the infrastructure around increasing sea level rise without squeezing out our shorelines is another major issue. And that's an issue not just for birds, I think, but for us, we're looking at this as in terms of the health and function of the estuary and the services that provides our communities. So salmon, killer whales, eelgrass, food systems, and clean water are all things that we're looking at and thinking about how to work with others to conserve. But as I mentioned, I was going to dig in a bit more to urban development, because urban development is one of those sources of stressors related to recreational disturbance. And really, I'm going to focus on coastal birds at this point. There's other activities inland that could be added to the list, but we are looking mostly right now at the coastal ecosystems. And basically, as we see an increase of people due to an expansion of the urban population, those people like to go out and recreate. And it's great that we have folks going out and enjoying nature and connecting with nature. But unfortunately, there's also some downsides. So some of the activities that we've witnessed having negative impacts on our bird populations are legal and illegal hunting, off-leash dogs, kiteboarding, dirt biking. Bird watching, unfortunately, I'm sad to say, can have a negative impact. Power boating, photography, drones, kayakers, kite surfing. And so we launched a program 2015-16 to try and identify where and which threats were having an impact on shorebirds, what locations we were seeing those threats, and who was participating in those activities, and what sort of actions could we implement to change how they participate in those activities. So we're not trying to stop those activities, but just change the behavior while they're participating in those activities. And so this started with a series of interviews in 3 areas that we found there was a high level of human activity. And how we determined that was both local experience, but also going back to those coastal waterbird survey results. One of the questions in those surveys is, are you seeing human activities of what kind? Dog walking or kayaking and that kind of thing. So that helped us narrow it down to 3 locations. As Pamela highlighted, it's not much of a surprise, but those 3 systems happen to be coastal sand locations and are very enjoyable and contain a number of attributes that people appreciate when out recreating. The main activities that we found people were undertaking was walking. The other category is a very fun one because one of the things that has emerged in the other is that people were going out to play Pokemon Go. And that is something that we had 0 anticipation for. So that's an interesting result that I'm not sure what we're going to do with, but a good learning. And of course, dog walking, that's a primary activity. And so there were a series of questions that we asked during those surveys, but I'm just going to highlight these ones. It was a question about what people, or it was a ranking exercise where folks were asked to rank what they thought would be most effective in terms of changing how people recreated on their favorite location. And interestingly enough, the implementation of recreational use zones came out ahead at 76%. Either thought it was mostly effective or very effective, followed by public education campaign. Better enforcement somewhat farther down the list at 68%. And then coming in last as an option was putting up more signage, so at 58%. And this is kind of consistent with what we've learned since then. In February of this year, after compiling the results from those surveys, we also convened a workshop of the local government and stakeholders to ask them a similar question. What are you currently doing? What are the opportunities and challenges you see? And then start identifying some strategies for next steps. And so some of the challenges that the local decision makers and stakeholders identified was a lack of understanding from the public in terms of impacts. And that's something that we saw mirrored in the surveys that we did on the beaches. Basically, folks were seeing that something like dogs chasing birds was a natural activity for dogs, or if they did recognize it as an issue, it was an issue that somebody else's dog was responsible for, not their own. So a lack of understanding was a big issue. Lack of consistent messaging and lack of enforcement capacity were some of the challenges the stakeholders saw around public awareness. But there's also a lot happening on this front. So there are a lot of public talks and groups working on outreach material that could include messaging. We have BC Nature and Bird Studies Canada working on important bird area signage. Tsawwassen First Nation is taking more actions on enforcement. And then we have local cities working on things like the nature partnerships, or the opportunity to address this issue at an upcoming roundtable at the IOC, the International Ecological Congress. And cities developing strategies to address the growing impact of recreational activities. So the Vancouver is developing an on-water strategy for non-motorized recreational vehicles, and has developed a new dog strategy that people were quite excited about. In terms of regulatory challenges, the one that came out at the top during those discussions was really the issue of overlapping jurisdictions. So it's a complicated landscape in terms of who has authority to act in these various parks and wildlife management areas, or ecological reserves. So that's something that's a bit of a barrier. Lack of enforcement capacity came up as a challenge as well, and that tied to the lower priority local governments have been placing on environment compared to health and safety issues from bylaw, and the fact that bylaw enforcement really is largely driven by complaints, especially when it comes to the environmental issues. And so that was a bit of a learning for all of us in terms of how do we work better with local enforcement. So working with cities to try and working in partnership with cities to try and allow for them to either enforce bylaws into the wildlife management areas, or perhaps develop more stringent regulation for the wildlife management area to make sure that they're consistent with what the cities are asking for within the parks. And help organizations share knowledge on implementation of objectives being set for wildlife management areas was one opportunity. And then, of course, whenever you look at a region as big as the Fraser, there's always the big picture issues. So things like climate-driven coastal squeeze, really the challenge around applied research, the ever-increasing populations, the conflicts of and pressure on land for industrial, agricultural, urban, and nature. And then that really got us to the point of a lack of species-focused protected areas. So we have lots of green spaces out there, but given the local government mandates, it's very challenging for them to develop conservation-specific protected areas at that scale. A disengaged public, and this loops back then to that public awareness challenge. But again, here there's lots happening. So you have a lot of folks working on curriculum development and nature centers, nature preschools, Green Scholar program coming out of parks, Vancouver Parks. Opportunities basically to engage educational processes. The SCCP has worked on school engagement in Beach Grove and other Boundary Bay communities. And Canadian Wildlife Service and East Environment Climate Change Canada, got it right, Pamela, very early, has been working on research associated with brants over on the island and harlequin ducks in around White Rock. So we're learning something there. And as mentioned already, Vancouver's working on water strategy. And then you have the communities of Delta, Surrey, Richmond, developing bird or biodiversity strategies and coastal adaptation strategies. So we're seeing progress, which is great. And so, as I mentioned, this last year has really been a year of learning. So we've taken the feedback from these workshops and these surveys and developed a recreational disturbance model to help us understand what the threats are, what the targets are, and some of the strategies that are out there. And this has helped us inform what some of the next steps might be. So Some of the things that we are thinking as next steps for the region, if we can find support, are gathering enforcement staff and managers from the various jurisdictions to discuss the opportunities for joint enforcement or increasing the awareness of the issue from bylaw enforcement. More consistent signage throughout the region. So it was mentioned that there's a diversity of signs that say many different things, but there's an opportunity to make that messaging more consistent and clear. Community groups can continue to play a role in terms of activities or engagement at local festivals and that sort of thing, but we could also start reaching out to those providing services to the recreators, so going to the kayak rental stores and that sort of thing to help develop messaging around what sustainable kayaking might look like. And finally, ensuring that coastal disturbance to birds is considered in any overarching conservation strategies or plans that might get developed. So the South Coast Conservation Land, no, that's not quite right. The South Coast Conservation Land Management Program is looking at the management plan for the wildlife management areas. That might be a region to get those objectives included. And if successful, I think the call from Laura and others about the need for an integrated conservation strategy is an important one to highlight. There's so much going on in this estuary that no one group can take on all of these issues. And so while Bird Studies Canada and others are working on strategies to specific issues, the overarching conservation strategy is a missing piece, and why Laura's work and others are so important, so that we can get some high-level political support and investment that hopefully triggers the action needed to conserve this estuary going forward. So I'll leave it at that, Pamela, and take questions.
All right, thank you very much, James. And I'm actually going to, Laura, if you can turn your mic on as well, because we got a question in just after James had started for you. And so I'll just start with Laura. So this question's from Derek Nishimura. Thank you for your PowerPoint. The species that were listed as a conservation concern in the Fraser may be transitory or migratory in the estuary, and threats to their life history may occur in another habitat, e.g. marine, Arctic, etc. Does the analysis take this into consideration?
Yep, that's a very good question. It's a tricky system to figure out a cutoff point, because so many of our species are migratory, or they depend on a region adjacent to the estuary. When we're developing our approach, we need to know whether or not an action will be effective. And we need to know, is it not coming up as effective as it could be because of the migratory nature of the species, or is it that we haven't got the action right? And so our main concern with that is figuring out what are the best things to do in this really relevant spot for so many species. And unfortunately, for the current project, we can't take into account all of the rest of the things going on outside of our study system, because simply we have a 2-year project and we just can't expand it to that level, because it very quickly gets a little bit out of control, as you might imagine. So it's a great question, and we're trying to figure out ways in which we can adapt this approach to look at more than one region for specific migratory species that are of specific importance. And so I guess I'll keep you posted, Derek, on that if we do have progress in that direction.
Okay, thanks very much, Laura. Any questions for James in regards to the work that Bird Studies Canada is doing? And while people are thinking about that, so James, I'll throw the same question at you about the issue of, the recent announcement that the Environment and Climate Change Canada viewed the impacts to the biofilm habitat, to the mudflats from Terminal 2 expansion as being significantly detrimental to sandpipers, and I would expect that any other bird that's utilizing biofilm or has an indirect dependency on that would be impacted by that as well. What is that? What do you think that actually means?
Great, I got a half an hour talk.
That's right. And try not to be too depressing either about political will and stuff like that.
No. It's so yes, absolutely. Given the fact that 95% of the Western sandpiper population uses that area or the estuary, let's say that, and a couple of other areas, the loss of that area has huge potential impacts on that population. Thankfully, migratory birds are protected through the Migratory Bird Convention Act. So we have a responsibility to maintain populations under that act, which is a great trigger for Environment Canada and climate change concerns. Unfortunately, the Environmental Assessment Program, right, SIA, the test isn't sustainability. The test is the public interest. So right. The panel may make a recommendation that it'll have significant negative consequences on the environment, but the minister or the cabinet, eventually I think this will go to, may come out and say that this is in the public interest due to the large economic value that has been identified for this region. Now, that's challengeable. You could get the same economic value from developing something in Rupert, or perhaps banning coal from what exists at Terminal 2 and or at the terminal already, and putting container points there. So there's other economic options. There aren't other economic options for the Western sandpiper. So that's not quite an apple and oranges trade-off, but I think that's where this is going, is that definition of public interest. And so I've been involved in a struggle against Flora Banks and LNG up there. Flora Banks is was a proposed LNG facility in Prince Rupert on the largest piece of eelgrass habitat in that region, and it was approved as being in the public interest. Kinder Morgan, not Kinder Morgan, the Enbridge pipeline was also approved as being in the public interest until that was redressed, and then more recently the Kinder Morgan one. So that argument about ecological importance versus public interest, I think, is where this discussion needs to go.
Right.
Birds and the Fraser Estuary are so critical, not just to the Canadian interest, but the interest of all people from South America up to Alaska, that and throughout the Pacific Ocean into the inland, that the argument becomes harder to make, I think. But anyways, those are my thoughts on it.
Interesting. Thanks very much for sharing that. All right. Does anybody else have any questions for Laura or James? Make little cricket sounds. Cricket, cricket, cricket. I really appreciate everybody making time today and staying on. Go outside and enjoy that sunshine. Spring appears to be here, and I'm hoping it will hold strong for the next few months. Although we sometimes do get snow in April, but anyway, don't curse it.
Can I put in a plug just a sec?
Yeah, sure.
2 important reviews are taking place right now that I think anybody that's concerned about the Fraser Estuary should probably think about commenting on. One is a review of the agricultural land reserve that the province is undertaking, and given the importance of agricultural land to biodiversity, that might be something that folks want to consider commenting on. And then 2 days ago, the federal government announced that there's going to be a review of the Port Authority and the regulations that guide their behaviors. And so I think that's another important opportunity that we should be looking to comment on.
And I should also note that the provincial government has just recently announced, well, this month, that they're also undertaking a review of the BC environmental assessment process. And they're looking for input on that. So it's interesting. The harmonization between the province and the feds when it comes to environmental legislation there seems to be a bit of I'm hoping a progressive and positive feedback in that regard. Well, I'd really.
Small thing from me.
Oh yeah, go ahead, Laura.
Sorry. Just very quickly, we are also hosting a session on the Fraser River Estuary in the Salish Sea Ecosystem Conference coming up in Seattle in April.
Right.
And so just to let you all know that there'll be a lot more information there and a panel of other speakers covering the other aspects of what makes the Fraser so important and potential solutions going forward. Great.
Super. Thank you so much. And for those that are hanging on there, this will be posted, as I mentioned, to our YouTube channel. The URL is up there, and I will put a notice on our Facebook page when it's ready to be viewed. And if you can share that, we would love it if you could help us just get things disseminated through social media or any listservs that you have. If you have any questions about today's presentation, you can email me direct at pamela@sccp.ca. Again, thanks everybody for attending. I hope this was useful to you. And as I said, this is the 5th in a series, and we will be having a couple more in the next year or so. So go out and enjoy the rest of the day. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Pamela.
Bye-bye.
Bye.